My name is Jim MacDonald. I'm an associate professor of beef cattle nutrition at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Today I was asked to summarize the data that's been collected evaluating the optimal time to harvest silage in relation to yield and quality. We've had some good talks today that have talked about maintaining the digestible dry matter that you collect in the pit. The difference in what I talked about today was maximizing the digestible dry matter that you bring into the pit. Historically, the recommendations for silage harvest have been based on a variety of indices. Probably the most common is milk layer. Dry matter, silage dry matter is how I tend to think in my mind. Days from silk layer or from silking, and days prior to milk line formation. And so the first thing that I did today was I tried to equilibrate all of those things. Talked about the vegetative stage of corn production, which all of the variation in hybrids, most of the variation in day length for hybrids affects the vegetative stage, which is nice for a nutritionist because I only have to think about the reproductive stage. And then we talked about the first 4 phases of the reproductive stages of corn and moving into the 5th stage of reproduction, which is when the corn starts to dent. You're probably targeting 35% or so moisture in the kernel, probably targeting about 30% dry matter in the whole plant. But the corn is beginning to dent. That's when most of the silage recommendations are based on. What we did, graduate students did at the University of Nebraska, is looked at the change in yield and the change in digestibility of the plant that was collected if silage harvests were changed from early in that R5 stage or dent stage of production all the way through black layer, which is the R6 stage of production. Yield increases as you move from R5 to R6. Yield, whole plant yield increases by about 15%. Okay, so even a 2-week delay in silage harvest will increase the yield that you collect from the field. The digestibility of the forage component is not changing dramatically. We see some subtle differences. The stem is not highly digestible, for example. The NDF content is decreasing slightly, and the digestibility of the NDF is remaining fairly constant. So if you think about the change from when the corn is denting until it black layers, the forage component of silage is not changing dramatically. There are some subtle changes, but it's not a drastic change. What is changing is you're increasing the amount of starch that's laid down as the milk layer moves down the kernel and as the plant continues to mature. So we're increasing the proportion of grain. That's what the increase in total yield comes from, and of course starch is highly digestible, and so our total capture of total digestible nutrients is increasing. In animal performance studies, we've done a couple of studies comparing silage, which averaged 37% dry matter, which was 2 weeks prior to black layer formation, and silage that was harvested at 43% dry matter, which was at black layer formation. In growing cattle, so cattle that were fed an 88% silage diet, harvesting later at black layer formation was actually detrimental. Animal performance was reduced, feed efficiency was reduced, no change in dry matter intake. Presumably the reason for that is we're at about 50% grain at black layer formation, and we know that there's negative associative effects of starch on fiber digestibility. Okay, so that may change the decision that a producer makes if they're using it for a high forage diet. In a feedlot, we saw no difference between those 2 harvest dates. A significant amount of silage in the diet did not change performance at all in finishing diets. And so the window for a finishing diet is probably a little bit larger than the window for a growing diet. In both of those instances, silage was harvested at a later time point than the traditional 33 to 35% dry matter. And so at 37%, we're able to increase the amount of yield without giving up the animal performance, at least in growing diets that you would see as you continue to increase the dietary starch as it moves into black layer formation.